Hi, this is Mr. Clemmons here to talk about Chapter 14 on the main battles of the Civil War, setting war objectives and devising strategies. Okay, Union thrust toward Richmond. This is in 1861 and into 1862. Lincoln rejected General Winfield Scott's strategies of peaceful persuasion through economic sanctions and a naval blockade. He insisted on an aggressive military campaign to restore the Union. He hoped a quick strike against the Confederates at Richmond would end the rebellion. The first attack was at Manassas, or also known as Bull Run, north of Richmond, and it led to panic among the Union soldiers who retreated to Washington. The Union enlisted 1 million more men to serve for 3 years in the new Union Army of the Potomac. In 1862, General McClellan launched a major assault, but Confederates fought back. The war continued, and Richmond was still secure. Now, at the Battle of Manassas, First Manassas, or also known as First Battle of Bull Run, in the early morning, the Union forces made a furious attack on the Confederates. But all day long, the Confederates at Manassas Junction were bringing in railroad cars filled with soldiers. And so by the middle of the afternoon, the Confederates were holding the line there at that battle. In fact, at one point, it looked like the Confederates were going to retreat. However, General Thomas Jackson, leading Virginians, was standing there like a stone wall, as one of the men said, and the other soldiers rallied to the Virginians, and they blocked the Union lines from winning the battle, and the Confederates turned the tide, and the Union troops turned and threw down their guns and ran away and head back to Washington, D.C. And so it turned into a very chaotic battle there at the end, where there was families that had come out to watch the battle. They thought there was going to be one battle and done, and they thought the battle would be the end of the Civil War. It wasn't, of course. It turned out not to be that way. But when the Union lines broke and they started retreating back, it turned into chaos. So families of senators and congressmen and local people from the city of Washington, D.C. that had ridden down to watch it and have a picnic had to go back in the midst of this chaos. So there was a chaotic retreat. The Confederates could have followed them into Washington, D.C., captured Washington, D.C., maybe captured Abraham Lincoln, and gotten him to sign a treaty just like Santa Anna did at the Battle of San Jacinto. But instead, the Confederates just threw their hats into the air and celebrated, huzzah, huzzah, huzzah. And it wasn't until a couple of weeks later that they realized they had missed their chance. Now, additionally, General Winfield Scott, the overall Union commander and advisor to Lincoln, came up with the Anaconda Plan, a strategy to defeat the South. The idea was to suffocate the South to death. It began with a blockade of all southern seaports, and there were only about a dozen of those. So if you put a dozen ships at a dozen seaports, that's about 144 ships, and the Union certainly has that in their Navy. It began with a blockade of southern seaports. Then Union gunboats would move north and south down the Mississippi River to cut off the food-producing states of Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas to the west, and thereby dividing the South. The Union would move up the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers to control the state of Tennessee and keep Kentucky firmly in the Union. Lastly, once Tennessee was secure, the Union armies would drive southeast across the southern Appalachian Mountains to Atlanta, Georgia, then on to the sea across Georgia to Savannah, further dividing the South. Now, Lee also moved into the north in 1862 to what became the Battle of Antietam. Confederate General Lee went on the offensive and routed Union troops at the Second Battle of Bull Run in 1862. General Lee then headed north into western Maryland, hoping that by taking their armies into the north, that maybe the North would give up. Lee's battle plan was accidentally lost, and the Union founded. This led to horrible Union casualties and savage warfare. The battle at Antietam, September 17, 1862, remains the bloodiest day in U.S. military history. 4,800 dead, 18,500 wounded, 3,000 of whom later died. It was a stalemate because of Lee's retreat. Lincoln claimed a victory, though, because they had retreated back into Virginia, and he made a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, but problems continued. Now, the war out in the West. In spite of Confederate successes back east, the war in the West in the Mississippi River Valley was very successful for the Union armies. The Union had success in the lower Midwest, gaining the Tennessee and Mississippi rivers. Union naval forces commanded by David C. Farragut struck the Confederacy from the Gulf of Mexico. Farragut captured South's financial center and largest city, New Orleans. They took control of 1,500 plantations and 50,000 slaves in 1862. Slaves on some plantations looted their owners' mansions, and others refused to labor unless they were paid wages. Union victory significantly undermined the Confederate strength in the Mississippi River Valley. The turning point in 1863, emancipation. Contrabands. Abolitionists began to demand emancipation as a part of the war effort. Slaves who escaped to Union armies were called contrabands of war. Confiscation Act of 1861 authorized the seizure of property used to support the rebellion. Some Union commanders took this to mean slaves. Radical Republicans worked for legislation that would end slavery in the rebellious states and outlaw slavery in the federal territories. Then comes the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln initially rejected emancipation as a war aim, but in August of 1862 he publicly linked black freedom with the preservation of the Union. Slavery could continue in those states that had not rebelled, like Maryland and Missouri, and areas occupied by Union armies, parts of Tennessee, western Virginia, and southern Louisiana, but Lincoln called emancipation an act of justice. Next, we'll look at the two big turning point battles. One was in the West and one was in the East. The battle for the Mississippi. General Grant sought to split the Confederacy in two. Now, the Union gunboats had come up from New Orleans and captured everything all the way up to Port Arthur on the Mississippi River, and they'd come down from Ohio along the Mississippi River up to Helena, Arkansas, and now they're going to make an assault on Vicksburg, Mississippi, the last railroad crossing for the Confederates across the Mississippi River between Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Louisiana. General Grant sought to split the Confederacy in two. He achieved the surrender at Vicksburg after a 6-week siege on July 4th, 1863. He took regions of Louisiana. Slaves began deserting the region near the Gulf of Mexico at that time. Lee's advance and defeat. This is back in the East. General Lee began to feel that if the North knew what war was like, they would seek peace. All the battles had been in the South so far. He invaded the North and met General George Meade at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in July of 1863. This was the largest battle in the history of the Western Hemisphere. It was a Union victory, but it was hard won and hard fought. After 3 days, there were 28,000 Confederate States of America soldiers' deaths and 23,000 Union deaths. So in that one battle, that one 3-day battle, more than 50,000 Americans died. It was the last effort by the Confederate States to invade the North. The Union victory increased the power of the Republican Party and its supporters. Union victories 1864 and 1865. Soldiers and strategy. The impact of black troops. Many Northern whites were initially offended by the idea of black people fighting for the Union. Emancipation Proclamation began to change public thinking on this issue. Northern whites now accepted that blacks would fight and die for the cause. In 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry's heroic and costly attack on Fort Wagner in South Carolina was critical in changing perspective on black soldiers. Discrimination was widespread, such as menial jobs at first and lower wages than their white counterparts, but later changes to pay were achieved. Also, capable generals began to take command in the war. General Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of Vicksburg, was appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac in March of 1864. He implemented President Lincoln's new strategy. Grant focused not just on battles, but on mobilization against Southern society. In other words, the disruption of Southern plantations and plantation life. He ordered 2 major offensives. Grant personally took charge of the Army of the Potomac and set out to destroy Lee's forces in Virginia. Even after he lost battles, he kept his army in Virginia and kept the pressure on the Confederates and on their capital at Richmond. Grant ordered General William Sherman to invade Georgia and take Atlanta, another part of that Anaconda Plan. A stalemate in 1864 and 1865. A psychological toll of fighting was enormous on both sides. As morale declined, soldiers deserted. Trench warfare outside Richmond and the Scorthurge campaign by Sherman revealed the desperation to end the war. The election of 1864 and Sherman's march to the sea. In the spring and summer of 1864, the National Union Party versus the Peace Democrats, the Republican Party, supported Lincoln for re-election. Lincoln demanded the surrender of the Confederate States and called for an end to slavery. Republicans called themselves the National Union Party. Democrats did not want emancipation, but they were split into 2 camps over war policy, whether to end the war and seek peace or to continue the fighting until the South surrendered. George B. McClellan, the former Union general, ran as the Democratic candidate. He vowed to end the war. The fall of Atlanta and Lincoln's victory. After General Sherman captured Atlanta, Lincoln promised the war would continue. The National Union Party, also known as the Republicans, labeled the Peace Democrats copperheads or poisonous snakes, and Lincoln won the election in 1864. In 1864, Maryland and Missouri, now firmly in Union control, changed their state constitutions and called for emancipation. William Tecumseh Sherman, hard war warrior, commanded the Union Army of Tennessee. After the capture of Atlanta, many Confederate soldiers were demoralized and abandoned. Sherman marched his army in a 60-mile wide path across Georgia to the sea, burning everything his army could not use. Sherman was treated as a savior by Georgia's black population. Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15, which set aside 400,000 acres for use of the freedmen. Later, though, that was rescinded. We were going to give land to the freedmen, but we never did that. Sherman captured Savannah and presented the city to Lincoln as a Christmas present in December of 1864. He invaded South Carolina, marched across the state, and pushed into North Carolina in the spring of 1865. Confederate General Johnson surrendered to Sherman shortly after Lee had surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, and that brought an end to the war in April of 1865.